What if the real battlefield in the Sahel is not fought with rifles, but with fertilizer and electricity? Burkina Faso imports more than 90% of the chemical fertilizer it uses. That single fact explains more about its vulnerability than many headlines about coups or alliances. When fertilizer prices rise on the global market, harvests shrink. When fuel costs increase, transport and irrigation become more expensive. And when electricity is unstable, small processing plants shut down before they ever grow. In a country where nearly 80% of the population depends on agriculture, whoever controls the inputs controls the future. So, when the Ministry of Energy in Ouagadougou gathers officials from the sectors of energy, agriculture, and water to discuss green hydrogen. This is not just another technical workshop. It is not a fashionable environmental slogan imported from Europe. It is a signal that Burkina Faso is beginning to think about the foundations of its economic independence. Green hydrogen, produced using renewable electricity, has been described by officials as a long-term strategic option, not an immediate solution, not a miracle, but a direction. And directions matter, because they tell us where a country intends to move when the pressure of crisis eases. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the language of self-reliance and endogenous development has become central to national discourse. The emphasis has been clear: reduce dependency, strengthen domestic production, regain control over strategic sectors. If that is the guiding philosophy, then green hydrogen may represent something larger than technology. It may be the industrial backbone of an agricultural strategy. In this analysis, we will examine 4 essential questions. First, what exactly is Burkina Faso dependent on today? Second, how could green hydrogen reshape the structure of agricultural and energy power? Third, why might external actors view this move with caution? And finally, is this a realistic long-term strategy or a high-risk bet in a fragile region? Because in the end, energy policy is never just about energy. It is about sovereignty. Burkina Faso's economic vulnerability does not begin with politics. It begins with inputs. The country imports the overwhelming majority of its chemical fertilizers, leaving its farmers exposed to decisions made in distant commodity markets. When international prices spike, the effect is immediate. Farmers reduce usage, crop yields decline, rural incomes shrink, food prices increase. What looks like a global supply chain fluctuation becomes a local crisis in villages across the country. Nearly 80% of Burkina Faso's population depends directly or indirectly on agriculture. This is not a marginal sector. It is the backbone of livelihoods, social stability, and domestic consumption. Yet the tools that sustain this backbone, fertilizer, fuel, and reliable electricity, remain largely beyond national control. Fertilizer is imported. Petroleum products are imported. Even electricity generation has historically relied on costly thermal inputs that tie domestic production to volatile global energy markets. The consequences are structural. When fuel prices rise, transportation costs increase. Irrigation pumps become more expensive to operate. Milling and processing facilities slow down or shut off. Farmers who are already operating on thin margins face a double burden: higher input costs and unpredictable market returns. Over time, this erodes confidence in investment and reinforces subsistence patterns instead of modernization. Energy dependency compounds the problem. Although Burkina Faso has significant solar potential, scaling renewable capacity requires capital, grid infrastructure, and long-term planning. Without stable electricity, rural electrification programs struggle to deliver transformative impact. Small agro-processing businesses cannot scale. Value addition remains limited. Raw products are exported while higher-value industrial stages occur elsewhere. This is why the discussion of green hydrogen must be understood against this backdrop of structural dependency. It is not merely an environmental conversation. It is an attempt to confront a fundamental economic weakness, the inability to control critical agricultural and energy inputs. For an older generation of farmers who have seen seasons disrupted by price shocks, this vulnerability is not theoretical. It is personal. When fertilizer doubles in price, the land does not argue. It simply yields less. And when a nation cannot secure the means of production for its primary workforce, its sovereignty remains incomplete. To understand why green hydrogen matters in this discussion, we must first strip away the jargon. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, but on Earth it is rarely found alone. It is usually bound to other elements, such as oxygen in water. Green hydrogen is produced by using electricity from renewable sources, such as solar power, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen through a process called electrolysis. If the electricity comes from clean sources, the hydrogen produced is considered clean as well. That simple explanation hides a powerful industrial implication. Hydrogen is a key ingredient in the production of ammonia. Ammonia, in turn, is the foundation of nitrogen-based fertilizers. In other words, without hydrogen, there is no modern fertilizer industry. Today, most global ammonia production relies on natural gas. Countries that do not control gas resources must import either the gas or the finished fertilizer. If Burkina Faso were able, over time, to produce green hydrogen domestically using its abundant solar potential, it could theoretically move into local ammonia production. That would not eliminate all imports overnight, but it would begin shifting the balance, instead of being entirely dependent on international suppliers. The country could gradually build a domestic supply chain for one of its most strategic agricultural inputs. There is also an energy storage dimension. Solar power is abundant in the Sahel, but it is intermittent. The sun sets every evening. Green hydrogen offers a way to convert surplus daytime electricity into a storable form of energy that can later be used for power generation or industrial heat. For a country struggling with grid stability, that flexibility has strategic value. Beyond agriculture, hydrogen can support industrial processes that require high heat, cement production, mining operations, and other heavy activities often depend on imported fossil fuels. Over decades, integrating green hydrogen could reduce exposure to volatile fuel markets. This is why green hydrogen should not be framed as a symbolic environmental gesture. It is an industrial tool. If developed carefully and realistically, it could allow Burkina Faso to industrialize the very inputs that determine whether its farmers prosper or struggle, and for a country seeking economic sovereignty. That distinction matters. What makes the recent workshop in Ouagadougou particularly significant is not just the topic of green hydrogen, but the structure of the conversation. Officials from the ministries of energy, agriculture, and water were brought together under what is often called a nexus approach. That word may sound technical, but its meaning is straightforward. It recognizes that food production, electricity generation, and water management are deeply interconnected. You cannot improve one without affecting the others. In Burkina Faso, irrigation depends on energy. Energy production, especially solar installations, depends on land and sometimes water for maintenance and cooling. Agriculture depends on both reliable electricity and access to water. When these sectors operate in isolation, policies tend to clash or leave gaps. When they are planned together, they can reinforce one another. The green hydrogen discussion fits directly into this integrated logic. If solar power is expanded to produce hydrogen, that same electricity infrastructure can support rural electrification. If hydrogen leads to local ammonia production, fertilizer becomes more accessible to farmers. If water resources are managed carefully, electrolysis can be integrated without undermining agricultural needs. The point is not to privilege one sector, but to design a system where gains in one area strengthen the others, for older policymakers and farmers alike. This is not abstract theory. It is practical experience. When electricity fails during harvest season, storage and processing suffer. When irrigation pumps lack fuel, yields decline. The Nexus framework attempts to treat these not as separate crises, but as parts of one structural challenge. Seen from this perspective, green hydrogen is not a standalone experiment. It is being positioned as a strategic component within a broader effort to reorganize how Burkina Faso produces food, manages water, and generates power. If implemented with discipline and long-term planning, this integrated model could gradually reshape the domestic production landscape. And in a region often forced to react to external shocks, proactive system design represents a quiet but meaningful shift in mindset. To understand how green hydrogen fits into Burkina Faso's broader direction, we must examine the political philosophy that has shaped recent national discourse. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the language of sovereignty, self-reliance, and endogenous development has moved to the center of policy discussions. The emphasis has been consistent: reduce external dependency, regain control over strategic resources, and strengthen domestic production capacity. This approach has often been framed in geopolitical terms, especially regarding military cooperation and foreign alliances. Yet, economic sovereignty is just as critical as security sovereignty. A country that must import nearly all of its fertilizer, a large share of its fuel, and significant portions of its industrial inputs cannot fully claim economic independence. The vulnerability is structural, not symbolic. Green hydrogen, therefore, aligns closely with this broader philosophy. It offers a potential pathway, over the long term, to produce ammonia domestically and reduce reliance on imported nitrogen-based fertilizers. It also connects to solar energy expansion, another strategic priority in a country with abundant sunlight. Instead of exporting raw agricultural goods while importing processed inputs, Burkina Faso could gradually internalize parts of its value chain. However, realism is essential. Hydrogen infrastructure is capital-intensive. Electrolyzers, storage facilities, safety systems, and ammonia plants require significant investment and technical expertise. Burkina Faso does not yet possess a mature hydrogen industry. Without careful planning, there is a risk of replacing one form of dependency with another, this time on foreign technology providers or external financing institutions. There is also the question of time. Farmers struggling today cannot wait decades for industrial transformation. The hydrogen strategy must therefore complement, not replace, immediate agricultural support measures. Short-term stability and long-term structural reform must proceed together, if approached pragmatically. Green hydrogen can be seen not as a political slogan, but as a long-horizon industrial policy. It signals intent rather than instant change. And in a region where short-term crises often dominate decision-making, the willingness to think 20 or 30 years ahead may itself represent a strategic shift in leadership mindset. Any serious discussion of Burkina Faso's hydrogen ambitions must also consider the international environment in which this strategy unfolds. The current government has faced criticism from several Western capitals over governance standards, media freedom, and political direction. Diplomatic tensions, visa restrictions, and sharp public statements have become part of the broader narrative surrounding the country's leadership. From a Western perspective, concerns often focus on democratic transitions, civil liberties, and shifting geopolitical alignments. Burkina Faso's reduced military cooperation with France and closer ties with alternative partners have raised questions about long-term stability and strategic orientation. In this context, any large-scale industrial policy, including hydrogen development, is inevitably viewed through a political lens. This external scrutiny has practical consequences. Hydrogen infrastructure requires capital, advanced equipment, and technical partnerships. If relations with major Western financial institutions or technology suppliers become strained, financing costs could increase. Access to concessional loans, grants, or expertise may become more limited. Even private investors factor political risk into their calculations. Higher perceived risk means higher borrowing costs or delayed commitments. At the same time, from the perspective of Ouagadougou, pursuing energy and agricultural self-sufficiency is not an act of defiance but of survival. A country facing security challenges and volatile commodity markets may reasonably argue that reducing dependency on imported fuel and fertilizer is a rational strategic objective. Economic sovereignty is framed not as ideology, but as resilience. The tension, therefore, is structural. Western partners emphasize governance standards and geopolitical alignment. Burkina Faso emphasizes autonomy and diversification. Green hydrogen sits at the intersection of these narratives. It is both a technical project and a symbol of direction. Whether it becomes a bridge for renewed cooperation or another point of friction will depend less on chemistry and more on diplomacy and institutional credibility. Looking ahead, Burkina Faso's green hydrogen strategy can unfold along several distinct paths. The first scenario is gradual and disciplined success. In this version, the government invests carefully in solar expansion, technical training, and pilot hydrogen projects. Partnerships are structured to include knowledge transfer and local workforce development. Small-scale ammonia production begins to supplement imported fertilizer. Over a decade or more, dependency declines incrementally. The change is not dramatic, but it is steady. Agricultural productivity improves as input supply becomes more predictable. Energy resilience strengthens. In this scenario, hydrogen becomes one piece of a broader industrial foundation. The second scenario is stagnation. Capital proves harder to secure than expected. Political risk raises borrowing costs. Technical capacity develops slowly. Pilot projects remain symbolic rather than transformative. Farmers continue to rely on imported fertilizer, and hydrogen remains a long-term concept without meaningful implementation. In this case, the vision exists on paper, but structural dependency persists in practice. The gap between rhetoric and reality widens, eroding public confidence. The third scenario is substitution without sovereignty. Hydrogen projects move forward, but they are heavily financed, owned, and operated by foreign partners. Equipment is imported, management expertise is external, and most profits are repatriated. Burkina Faso hosts the infrastructure but captures limited strategic value. Dependency shifts form, but not substance. Instead of relying on imported fertilizer, the country relies on externally controlled hydrogen supply chains. For policymakers, the lesson is clear. Technology alone does not guarantee autonomy. Institutional discipline, transparent agreements, and long-term capacity building determine whether a new industry strengthens sovereignty or merely changes its appearance. Green hydrogen offers opportunity, but only governance and strategic clarity will determine which path becomes reality. If we step back from the technical language, the strategic outline becomes clear. Burkina Faso is attempting to address its deepest economic weakness by targeting the inputs that sustain its people. Fertilizer, fuel, and electricity are not abstract sectors. They are the foundations of agricultural survival and national stability. Controlling them means controlling the direction of development itself. That is the core of sovereignty today. Green hydrogen, in this context, is less about environmental prestige and more about industrial leverage. By linking solar expansion to ammonia production, the country seeks to shorten supply chains that once stretched across oceans. It aims to transform sunlight into fertilizer and fertilizer into stability. Instead of reacting to global price shocks, policymakers would gradually build buffers within their own territory. That shift changes incentives. Yet strategy is always tested by reality. Capital, expertise, and political trust do not materialize overnight. Hydrogen infrastructure demands patience, transparency, and disciplined agreements. If contracts are opaque or capacity building is neglected, the promise of autonomy could quietly erode. The difference between sovereignty and substitution will depend on who owns the knowledge, who trains the engineers, and who retains the profits over time consistently. For other African nations watching closely, the lesson extends beyond Burkina Faso. Modern technologies can become tools of emancipation or new chains of dependence. The decisive factor is not the machinery itself, but the institutional will to anchor it in domestic priorities. Training, regulation, and regional cooperation must accompany investment from the beginning. Otherwise, ambitious projects risk drifting away from communities they claim to serve. Ultimately, the hydrogen conversation returns to a simple question: who controls the inputs that allow a nation to feed itself and power its economy? Burkina Faso has signaled that it intends to participate in the technologies shaping the next industrial era rather than waiting on the margins. Whether that intention matures into durable sovereignty will depend on discipline, inclusion, and credibility. The choice remains open.